It is September 1692, and the leaves around Salem Village have started to turn. On a field just west of town, a makeshift pit lies dug in the ground. Two thick wooden boards are laid across it. Beside them, a pile of large stones glints with morning dew. Sheriff George Corwin stands over a man in his 70s. His name is Giles Corey. He has been a farmer here for decades, a wiry man with a stubborn jaw and calloused hands. Now he is shirtless and lying on his back in the pit. The sheriff orders men to lay the boards across Corey's chest and then place a heavy stone on top. The weight presses down. Corey gasps. "Giles Corey," the sheriff intones, "how do you plead?" Silence. Corwin motions for another stone. It lands with a dull thud. Corey's ribs strain. "More," he whispers, "more weight." The crowd of onlookers murmurs, some horrified, others convinced this suffering is godly justice. This is not rogue sadism. Under English common law, a person who refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty could be subjected to peine forte et dure, pressing with heavy weights to coerce them. Without a plea, the court could not proceed. With a conviction, the defendant's property would be confiscated and his heirs disinherited. Corey knows this. By staying mute, he hopes to preserve his estate for his children. He also knows that pressing can kill. Corwin asks again. Corey looks up from under hundreds of pounds of stone. "More weight," he says. Whether the words are exactly his or polished by later legend, the defiance is real. He will not plead. As the sheriff places yet another stone, you can hear the boards groan. Corey's chest rises painfully, then settles. Sweat mingles with dirt. The sheriff repeats the question. Corey's lips are cracked. He will not speak. The pressing goes on for hours. On the third day, with stone after stone crushing bone and forcing air from his lungs, Giles Corey dies. Around him, neighbours watch. Some have known him for decades. A few whisper prayers. Others believe the devil is finally losing one of his agents. Under those stones, a man chose silence so the law couldn't take his land. Around him, a community believed God was watching and approving. How did Salem get here? And what does it mean when a court kills to defend invisible truths? Before the fits began, Salem Village was already split. The settlement, inland from the bustling port of Salem town, was a patchwork of small farms, rough taverns, and meeting houses. By 1692, the frontier was only a few miles away, and the memory of war sat like a ghost at every hearth. The 1675-76 conflict known as King Philip's War had seen homes burned and settlers killed throughout New England. In the 1680s and 1690s, King William's War sent refugees fleeing from the main frontier southward into Massachusetts. Many of the afflicted girls were daughters and nieces of these refugees. They had seen parents, siblings, and neighbors slaughtered by Wabanaki and French forces and now lived in Salem Village with those memories. Letters from the time talk more about Indian raids than about witches. To the people of Essex County, demons were not abstract. They wore the faces of the enemy and the shadows of the woods. Economically, the community was divided between Salem town and Atlantic Port, whose merchants traded lumber and fish with the West Indies, and Salem Village, an inland farming settlement. The farmers resented the traders' wealth. The traders scoffed at the farmers' parochialism. The Massachusetts Bay Colony's charter had been revoked by King Charles II and then reinstated in 1691 under a new charter that merged Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay and loosened voting requirements. Many land titles were suddenly in question. Taxes increased. Small farmers like the Putnams, who dominated the village, feared losing their land. They contested boundaries with neighbors from Topsfield, including the Nurse, Easty, and Wilds families. These disputes sometimes turned violent. One episode saw Topsfield men seize Putnam timber and hide it in the swamp. Another ended with accusations of assault. The Putnams claimed moral high ground. Their enemies called them greedy. Inside Salem Village's meeting house, factionalism revolved around Reverend Samuel Parris. Parris, a failed Barbados merchant, had accepted the pulpit in 1689 after village leaders promised him a house, salary, and firewood. But the villagers soon balked at paying his wages. They withheld his salary, haggled over his promised firewood, and voted to dismiss him. Paris retaliated by preaching sermons that accused his congregation of ingratitude and worldliness. Meetings degenerated into shouting matches. One opposition group, including respected families like the nurses and porters, petitioned to oust him. Another, including the Putnams, defended him fiercely. The division between town and village, between merchants and farmers, between Paris supporters and opponents, formed cracks across which suspicion could leap. Property and inheritance disputes laced these cracks. Sarah Osborne, one of the first women accused of witchcraft, scandalized the village when she married her Irish indentured servant and attempted to take control of land held in trust for her sons. Sarah Good, another early target, had lost her father's tavern to debt litigation and drifted between households begging for scraps. She was pregnant, homeless, and often heard muttering to herself. Even her husband admitted she was enemy to all good. In a society where land and reputation were currency, being poor, litigious, or disorderly marked you as a threat. Religious anxiety heightened the tension. Puritan ministers thundered from pulpits that the devil prowled New England seeking souls. Cotton Mather had recently published accounts of demonic possessions. In his Cases of Conscience, he warned that the devil could impersonate a righteous person, but urged caution. Better that 10 witches escape than one innocent suffer. Yet fears persisted. Rural families recited tales of evil spirits afflicting cattle and crops. Folk practices flourished under a veneer of piety. When children fell sick or cows miscarried, some neighbors whispered of maleficium. It needed only a spark. The village was already cracked. A single incident would cause it to split. What we see here is not a sleepy Puritan idyll, but a place where war, debt, property, theology, and personal grudges created a volatile brew. In such a landscape, invisible threats were easy to imagine. Who among your neighbors might be allied with the devil? Whose land claim might be a coven's plot? When law, religion, and property merge, suspicion thrives. Salem was poised to burn long before the first torch was lit. The spark came in the winter of 1691-92 when two girls in the Paris household, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, began to twist and convulse. Their limbs jerked. They cried out that invisible hands pinched and bit them. When the local doctor, William Griggs, could find no natural cause, he pronounced them under an evil hand, turning a family illness into a legal matter. More girls soon exhibited fits. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott. Many were refugees from the wars on the main frontier. They claimed that specters, ghostly shapes resembling neighbors, appeared to them and ordered them to sign the devil's book. Puritan belief held that the devil could not impersonate an innocent person. Therefore, if the specter of Goody Proctor tormented you, Goody Proctor must have consorted with Satan. This idea became the core of spectral evidence. Desperate to identify the afflictors, a neighbor named Mary Sibley suggested a folk remedy: bake a witch's cake. She instructed Tituba and John Indian, enslaved Africans in the Paris household, to mix rye flour with the girl's urine, bake it, and feed it to the family dog. According to English folk magic, if witchcraft were involved, the dog would react when it ate the bewitched urine. Tituba complied. The dog did nothing. Reverend Paris, upon learning of the ritual, denounced it from the pulpit as going to the devil for help against the devil. Mary Sibley confessed before the congregation and was restored to communion after the church raised its hands in forgiveness. The episode revealed that even pious colonists resorted to charms when prayer failed, and that scapegoating could pivot instantly. Many villagers blamed Tituba for the cake, though she had simply followed a white woman's instructions. Soon the afflicted named 3 women as tormentors: Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. They were archetypes of vulnerability. Tituba was enslaved, foreign, and associated with Barbados. Sarah Good was destitute, pregnant, and quarrelsome. Sarah Osborne had challenged inheritance norms. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin arrested them on March 1st. The examinations took place in the Salem Village meeting house. Neighbors packed into benches, the girls writhed on the floor. Sarah Good protested her innocence. Sarah Osborne denied making a compact with the devil and died in jail weeks later. Tituba, under questioning and likely fearing beating or execution, confessed. She spun a lurid tale of a tall man in black demanding her allegiance, of a great red book with many names, of animal familiars, a yellow bird, a black dog. She said the devil forced her to sign. Her testimony grew with each question. When asked if she had seen the specters of other villagers tormenting the girls, she at first said no, then named Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. The judges, hungry for corroboration, seized on these details. Tituba's confession provided a template. Accuse others and you may live. Deny and you will hang. More accusations followed. Jails filled with neighbours who had been in property disputes, women who had quarrelled with ministers, and even John Proctor, a tavern keeper, who called the girls frauds. Confession became a desperate strategy for survival. The acceptance of spectral evidence was unprecedented. In England, witches were no longer executed by the late 17th century. Massachusetts magistrates, however, cited a 1662 English case overseen by Sir Matthew Hale as precedent for admitting visions as proof. The Salem courts were staffed by laymen with little legal training. Guilt was assumed. If a jury returned a not guilty verdict, it was often sent back to reconsider. The afflicted would thrash and shriek during preliminary hearings, pointing to specters only they could see. That performance counted as 2 witnesses, satisfying the legal requirement for a capital conviction. The result was an evidentiary system that punished invisible crimes. Was this still law, or had theology consumed jurisprudence? When the mind becomes a courtroom and visions become testimony, the burden of proof disappears. This is psychological torture masked as procedure. As spring turned to summer, the net widened. Martha Corey, wife of Giles, questioned the legitimacy of the girls' fits and was promptly accused. John Proctor criticized the proceedings and suggested whipping the accusers. He and his pregnant wife were jailed, along with their children. Deliverance Hobbs and her daughter Abigail confessed under pressure and implicated dozens more. Accusations crossed boundaries of wealth and status, ensnaring housewives like Rebecca Nurse, prosperous farmers like John Proctor, and former ministers like George Burroughs. Meanwhile, townsmen like Samuel Nurse and Francis Nurse petitioned the court to release their kin and were ignored. By midsummer, jails from Salem to Ipswich to Boston overflowed with more than 150 accused. The law had become a net thrown by fear, hauled by gossip, and mended by ministers. Its cords tightened around anyone who challenged its weave. On June 10, 1692, the hangman's rope found its first Salem neck. Bridget Bishop, a middle-aged tavern owner who wore a scarlet bodice and had been charged with witchcraft years earlier, stood on a wooden ladder at the top of Gallows Hill. The hill, a rocky rise outside Salem town, was accessible by cart and commanded a view of the harbor. Ministers prayed. Sheriff Corwin adjusted the rope. Bishop maintained her innocence to the end. When the ladder was kicked away, she dropped. The crowd gasped. Some cheered, convinced justice had been served. Others whispered. The physical act of hanging, a body twitching at the end of a rope, horrified even those who had believed in her guilt. Afterwards, the sheriff forbade her family from removing the body. It was cut down and dumped into a crevice between rocks. Such disposal prevented mourners from creating graves that might become sites of martyrdom. July 19th brought the execution of 5 more: Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Rebecca Nurse, and Sarah Wilds. They recited prayers, sang psalms, and proclaimed innocence. Rebecca Nurse, 71 and stone deaf, had once been among the most pious women in Salem. As the noose tightened, she said, "Lord, have mercy on me." The hangings did not quell the panic, they fed it. On August 19th, the rope took George Burroughs, John Proctor, George Jacobs Sr., John Willard, and Martha Carrier. Burroughs was the former minister of Salem Village. Atop the ladder, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly. The crowd murmured. Witches were supposed to be unable to recite it. Cotton Mather, watching from horseback, urged the crowd not to be swayed. Satan can transform himself into an angel of light. The hangman did his duty. After Burroughs' body twitched its last, it was stripped naked and left in the crevice. Families were not permitted to bury their dead. Some risked punishment by digging up their relatives at night and reburying them on family land. The rope and the refusal to let bodies rest became part of the terror. On September 22nd, 8 more were executed: Martha Corey, Mary Easty, Alice Parker, Anne Pudieta, Mary Parker, Wilmot Redd, Margaret Scott, and Samuel Wardwell. 3 days earlier, Giles Corey had been pressed to death. Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse, had already been released once when her accusers retracted their claims. She was rearrested after the fits resumed. Awaiting execution, she wrote a petition not to save her own life, but to stop further bloodshed. "I petition not for my own life, for I know I must die," she wrote, "but that no more innocent blood be shed." She warned that confessing witches had lied to save themselves and urged the court to examine them. Her plea was ignored. She mounted the ladder, prayed for those who condemned her, and joined the others. The hanging ritual had its own choreography. Condemned prisoners were carted from jail to Gallows Hill. They were allowed to speak before the rope tightened. Some used the moment to denounce the court, others to forgive their accusers. Ministers addressed the crowd, framing the executions as warnings. After each death, the sheriff cut the rope and the body fell into a trench. The crowd dispersed across the fields. There were no ballad sellers or gingerbread men. This was not Tyburn. Salem's execution theater was somber, saturated with scripture and fear. Yet it too had spectators. Curious children, anxious parents, skeptics who whispered that an innocent had been hanged. As the hangings multiplied, some onlookers began to doubt. Why, they wondered, would God allow a former minister to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly if he were a witch? Why would pious women pray on the ladder if they were damned? Doubt was itself a dangerous thought. By the end of September, 19 people had been hanged and 1 pressed to death. Many more languished in jail. The killing paused, not because the devil had been vanquished, but because the spectacle became intolerable. When the wife of Governor William Phipps was accused, and when merchants from Boston began questioning the legality of spectral evidence, the machinery slowed. But before it stopped, Gallows Hill served as Salem's own execution factory, a place where invisible accusations were made painfully visible by rope and weight. Giles Corey's silence looms large in the Salem story. Born around 1611 in Northamptonshire, he arrived in Massachusetts as a young man and settled near Salem. He was not a saint. In 1676, he beat a hired farmhand, Jacob Goodale, so severely that the young man died. A coroner's jury accused him of murder, but he was convicted only of using unreasonable force and fined. Corey was litigious, suing neighbors over fences and debts. He and his wife Martha were entangled in land disputes with the Putnams and others. He joined the Salem church late in life and seemed to relish suing and being sued. When the witchcraft accusations began, he first testified against his wife, then recanted. In April 1692, Ann Putnam Jr. and Mercy Lewis claimed his spectre tortured them. Magistrate Hathorne asked him to plead. Corey refused. Without a plea, the court could not convict him and thus could not seize his property. If he pleaded and was found guilty, his land would be confiscated. Under peine forte dure, he would be pressed until he submitted. Pressing was rare in New England. It dated to 13th century England and was meant to coerce pleas, not to kill. We do not know exactly how many stones were used or how long Corey's pressing lasted. Contemporary accounts say it occurred over 2 or 3 days. Sheriff Corwin, known for harshness, his house later earned the nickname the Witch House, presided. Witnesses said Corey asked for more weight and cursed Sheriff Corwin. Longfellow later imagined him saying, "If I deny, I am condemned already in courts where ghosts appear as witnesses. If I confess, then I confess a lie." The legend captures his quandary. By refusing to plead, he turned his body into a protest. Each stone was an accusation, each breath denied the court its conviction. When he died, his tongue protruded from his mouth. The sheriff reportedly pushed it back with his cane. Corey's act saved his estate for his heirs. It also exposed the law's brutality. The court tortured a body to extract a word. The pressing echoes the larger violence of Salem. Spectral evidence pressed the mind, peine forte dure pressed the flesh. In both cases, silence became a weapon. For Corey, silence protected property. For those who refused to confess, silence preserved their integrity. The law demanded words, guilty or not guilty, to operate. Corey's refusal jammed the machine. In doing so, he forced the community to watch a man be killed for not speaking. Even the sheriff, a zealous persecutor, may have felt unease. When we crush a chest to defend intangible evidence, what is truly on trial? The man under the stones or the system placing them there? Corey's death profoundly affected Salem. 3 days after his pressing, 8 people were hanged. Ministers like Increase Mather, who had preached about devils and witches, began to question spectral evidence. Governor Phipps, after returning from fighting the French in Maine, wrote to the English Privy Council that his colony's courts were in a hurry and had relied on spectre evidence. He dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29, 1692. A new superior court refused to accept spectral testimony. Without that evidentiary loophole, the prosecutions collapsed. Corey's silence and the revulsion it provoked were part of the turning point. In January 1693, the new court acquitted or reprieved most remaining defendants. Governor Phipps forbade the practice of keeping acquitted prisoners in jail until they paid fees. Spectral evidence vanished from the courtroom, but the damage could not be undone. 19 people were hanged, 1 pressed to death, 5 died in prison, dozens suffered physical and mental trauma, families were ruined, homes fell into disrepair, while their owners sat in jail. When the last witchcraft prosecutions ended in the spring of 1693, Salem tried to forget, but the mark remained. The Superior Court dismissed dozens of indictments, including those against Rebecca Jacobs, Mary Osgood, and Job Tukey. Governor Phipps pardoned Dorcas Hoare, a widow with 4 children, after she confessed, and a group of ministers petitioned for her life. Others remained in jail for months simply because they could not pay fees for their chains and board. One petitioner wrote that his sister hath been in prison since May last, and hath had nothing but bread and water, and is almost starved. These administrative cruelties outlived the panic itself and revealed how debt and punishment intertwined. Compensation came slowly and unevenly. In 1697, the General Court declared a day of fasting and humiliation, and Judge Samuel Sewall publicly confessed his role, writing in his diary that the day was dedicated to the death of the witchcrafts. 14 years later, in 1711, after years of petitions, the legislature reversed the convictions of many victims and allocated $600 to be divided among their heirs. The nurses received about £25, Mary Eastey's family £15, John Proctor's heirs, $150. Not all families were compensated. Those of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne received nothing, perhaps because poverty and notoriety made them easier to ignore. Some accepted the money out of necessity, others refused to put a price on a life. The search for justice continued long after the last rope was cut. In the early 19th century, local historians began challenging the narrative that the executed were witches. In 1957, the Massachusetts legislature formally exonerated Ann Puditer, Bridget Bishop, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, Sarah Good, and Sarah Wilds. In 1992, for the 300th anniversary of the trials, the towns of Salem and Danvers erected memorials, a stone bench for each victim inscribed with their name, execution date, and, where known, last words. Visitors leave flowers and notes. In 2001, the governor of Massachusetts signed a bill clearing the last 5 victims, including Elizabeth Johnson Jr., who had been condemned at age 22 but reprieved. The memorials and exonerations do not resurrect the dead, but they signal a willingness to name and remember them. Every generation seems to feel the need to apologize anew, perhaps because each finds its own analogies in the events of 1692. Yet the questions remain: what evidence do we accept? How do we balance fear and justice? When people in authority label others as threats, what safeguards stand between accusation and execution? Salem left legal echoes. The U.S. Constitution forbids bills of attainder and ex post facto laws. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right to confront witnesses. Lawyers cite Salem when warning against admitting coerced confessions or unreliable testimony. The phrase witch hunt now describes political purges and moral panics. Historians see Salem as a prototype for later panics. In the 1950s, U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed to see communists everywhere. During the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, daycare workers were accused of ritual abuse based on the testimonies of children coached by adults. After September 11, 2001, some argued for abandoning due process to fight terrorism. Each time, fear sought shortcuts around the law. Invisible enemies justified extraordinary measures. Salem shows where that path leads, to gallows and pressing pits. Spectral evidence is gone, but new specters, communists, child abusers, terrorists, take its place. Invisible wounds become visible chains. The question is never just who we punish, but what fears we're trying to quiet when we tighten the rope or add a stone. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Salem returned to being a small coastal town. The name of Gallows Hill faded from maps, but the story of Giles Corey's silence and the women who prayed on the ladder endures. Law and religion colluded to destroy lives based on dreams and grudges. Property disputes were settled with rope, social grievances with accusations. In the end, repentance came too late for the dead. The legacy of the trials lies in our vigilance against the next panic. When fear rises, will we remember Salem? Will we ask for evidence that can be seen, touched, and tested? Or will we see specters and reach for the stones? If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing to the Darkest Archives. We uncover forgotten crimes, examine historical trials, and explore the darker corners of justice and consequence. New episodes are released weekly.